It's truly a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all today. I've respected the work of the Institute, and I appreciate the invitation from Ralph and Linda and the chance to be with you all. I really respect your work, and I'm excited to be here to share this time with you. So I just finished reading this book by Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy. Some of you may have read it. Great book. And one thing, he had a quote in there from his grandma, something his grandma told him when he was growing up, and she said, you can't understand most of the important things from a distance. You have to get close. You have to get close. And this is something that when I read that, I started underlining it in bold letters, because that's what I believe. This is what I believe, that if we want to learn about homelessness and we want to respond to it, we can't do it from a comfortable distance. We have to get close to the action. So in all the work that I try to do, and the work I've tried to do, I've based it on closeness to the action, closeness to the people that matter. So rather than spending my time behind, in an office, I prefer to do it in the places where the action is happening. And so what I would like to talk about today is some of the lessons from the last 10 years of being in shelters, in schools, from being in early childhood centers, from visiting with mothers, hundreds of mothers and hundreds of providers. What do we learn from up close? And what can we do moving forward? So my background was as a school teacher as well. I was a high school teacher. I worked in a homeless shelter before that. And I've kind of worked in a variety of education settings. So that closeness for me was something I never wanted to leave as I got into this kind of different career. We know, as we've heard this morning, and you all know, working in this issue, we know there are like these big policy solutions when it comes to homelessness, of affordable housing, of jobs that pay well, really critical, important kind of big things, of ongoing learning opportunities for adults and for kids, of rich learning opportunities, and just more broadly of kind of building healthy communities where everyone can thrive. These are the critical issues in homelessness. These are foundational issues. But one thing that we've learned, that I've learned with my students and with those I work with, from both when I worked in the schools and where I'm working now, is that often those who work in organizations, those who work kind of what we call in the middle, can often be a little bit paralyzed by some of these discussions. In other words, saying like, I work in a school, I'm a third grade teacher, I can't create affordable housing for my kids, but they're walking in every day homeless. Or I work at a child care center, and these kids' parents are unemployed. I can't affect that. And people, as a result of that, in many instances, are feeling a little bit, as these big conversations are held, feeling like disempowered. At the same time, there are these everyday conversations that are had in these organizations, just trying to keep afloat. We don't know if we're going to have enough in this organization to get to next month. We don't know if our resources are coming from the government. We can hardly get by each day. Those are the other conversations I hear every day in the shelters. How are we going to get enough for lunch tomorrow? I can't worry about I need to serve lunch tomorrow. So in the middle, we often find a lot of people working in the middle of these big conversations and the little everyday ones. Every day. You see it in New York. You talked about it earlier. Ralph mentioned it. So what I want to talk about today is that, there are these big solutions for complex challenges that are really critical. They're engaged by a lot of you, and that is foundational work. There are these daily service provision questions that a lot of you face every day, and they're also critical. But what I want to talk about today a little bit is somewhere in the middle of that. How can organizations best function in the middle of homelessness? If you work in if you work in a school, if you work in a shelter, if you work in a food pantry, if you work in a daycare center, what can you do in the middle? What makes a great organization in that middle space? So one thing I would say that we've learned most powerfully is one way to do that, one way to think about that, is by refocusing upon the everyday, we call the everyday, and by making the everyday better. That's something we can do in organizations. So first, let's talk about, what is the everyday? What is the everyday? There's actually kind of like an academic literature called Everyday Sociology, and talks about what makes up, kind of in a very specific way, what the everyday is. And I'll talk about 4 things that people talk about with the everyday. One is the everyday in each of our lives is social, right? We are affected every day by who is around us. We don't live in a vacuum. The everyday is social. Our relationships can be a very positive thing, it can be a negative thing, or somewhere in between, but the everyday is social. The everyday is routine. These are things that are repeated and regular. They're things we do every day. Often don't think a lot about them, but we do them every day. They take up a big part of our lives. We don't even pay attention to the everyday, right? We don't notice this. It's not what we go home and talk about at night. It's not what you see a 60 Minutes news story about often. Lastly, the everyday is localized, meaning where you are, the shape and setting where you are shapes the everyday. So the everyday is not just some inconsequential thing that we're not noticing, that we're doing every day in our repeated routines. The everyday is a place where family aspiration, reflection, and formation take place. It's not in these fancy programs that we read about, it's in the everyday. So as these things are going on, we aspire toward the future. As these things are going on, we reflect upon where we are. So one thing that we've learned very powerfully that all of you see every day is the everyday is rattled and redefined by homelessness. There are the big things that happen. There are the big traumas that occur. But also, while that's going on, what we often don't read about is how these everyday little things we do are undercut, rattled, and shaken. So the hope is that we have found that there are organizations can impact that. Organizations can shape the everyday. I don't think that this is a hopeless conversation. I think that there are things that we've learned, which I'd like to share with you today, about how organizations can work in the middle to affect the everyday in a positive manner. So I don't want to say that these things are not relevant. They're hugely relevant, but let's talk today about how the organizations shape the everyday. So we've learned 5 things I want to talk to you about, and it came up with an acronym. I often think acronyms are a little bit hokey, but here's a good one because it's BEATS, all right? It's a good acronym. You can remember these 5 things by it. I want to talk about everyday brokering, everyday embedding, experimenting, targeting of high doses, and zeal in all practice. Let's give you some examples of what we've learned and some examples from outside spaces as well. First of all, this idea of brokering. There was a book written by Mario Small that I really highly recommend this book. I've talked about it a lot over the last couple of years. It's impacted my work a whole lot. And Mario Small is now a professor at Harvard University, and he went and studied hundreds of child care centers throughout the U.S. And he wanted to learn about what makes a good child care center. And he talked about, the book is called Unanticipated Gains, right? And one thing he talked about is like when you go to a child care center, you have a certain expectation when you go there, right? You want, at the very baseline, you want to drop off a child, and at the end of the day, pick up the same child in relatively good shape, right? At a baseline. Let's just hope that happens. He said, though, that the best ones, the best places, deliver these other things. By nature of going to those places, you get other benefits, unanticipated gains. I signed up to bring my 5-year-old here to keep her safe, but I got these other things out of being at this place. This is something we've learned in a lot of the places that we've talked to over the last 10 years, that the best places delivered a service. You know, it may have been childcare, it may have been a housing voucher, it may have been shelter. The best places gave more. The best places learned about the people who were coming and made connections. They brokered connections for them that improved their lives. They're very much related to what you said earlier, Ralph, about understanding the people that we're working with and looking at their needs more holistically, right? I want to share one example of a place that brokered so well that we learned about, and as a result, this is a guy who's become one of my closest friends. His name is JP, Jeff Patterson. He's a barber. Okay, now in Madison, there's a big discussion. One of my colleagues, Martha, is here and knows about this discussion about partnerships and collaboration between the school and community. Lots of thinking sessions and working panels about how can we get parents engaged, how can we get partnerships formed, how can we collaborate. And they've been struggling with this for years, right? And years of how do we get parents to come to the school, how do we do these things. In the shadows of those schools, there's this little barber shop on the south side of Madison called JP Hair Design. Now, this is a guy who got his degree in cosmetology, came to Madison to be a barber, and he soon said, wait a second, I can do more. He's operating on a shoestring budget. Now, what are you seeing there? Are you seeing haircuts? Yep. You're also seeing multiple generations. You're seeing information on the walls about further education. You're seeing information about jobs. You're seeing relationships developed over time. You're seeing a thriving social space where people can come and get a good haircut, but they get a whole lot more. They get a whole lot more, and as a result, his business is getting better and better. So one thing JP learned was that people were coming in there craving a haircut, but they're craving connection. He's working with a lot of our homeless. He's working with a lot of our kids who are living in poverty, and he is their institutional connection. One thing he learned was a lot of people need information, so what did he do? He created a TV show called JP Behind the Chair. He puts it on YouTube once a month. Look it up, JP Behind the Chair. He brings in community leaders. He's got local pastors that come in. He's got local bankers that come in. He's got educators that come in. And he talks to them for 10 minutes about the information people need. So you come into his shop, you get the information. You can look him up on YouTube and learn from JP. He is a broker, right? So when he hires people on his staff, he's hiring people with the technical skills to cut hair. He's hiring people who are brokers. Why can't we do the same in schools? So when we talk about connections, we're talking about connections to people, but even bigger, we're talking about connections to ideas. Okay, so one thing we've recommended to all the places we're working with is to send out scouts, right? We're connecting to people, but go learn. Don't just go learn from the local school that's just like yours. Don't just go learn to the shelter that's like yours. Go to the barber shop and learn. Go to the church and learn. Go to the people who are doing the work in new and different ways and learn from them. So one question I would ask you, and we always ask the schools we work with, this is something we work with when we work with schools, is what advantages do students receive as a result of being as part of your school? You could say the same about clients coming to your place of business. Is it just the service? Or is it more? What advantages do parents and families receive as a part of it? And then bigger question, what advantages does your community receive from your place? These are the questions we ask schools. These are brokering questions. Okay, so that's the B. We talk about this idea of embedding. Embedding is a second term we've learned over the years. What we're talking about here is that when we've gone around to a lot of organizations, a lot of these places, you have people who are like in executive director roles of organizations, manager roles. They have some degree of leadership, who got into the work because they were they were socially committed to the work. They wanted to do good. They wanted to contribute to the issue. But very soon, in their roles of leadership, they were removed from the front lines of action, and they spent their time behind the computer. They spent their time writing grants. They had no time to be close to the action. Now, that had implications in two big ways that we see. Two big ways. One was that it left a lot of folks, when they moved up the ladder, the hierarchy of the organization, feeling kind of disconnected and almost disenfranchised from the very work that they wanted to do. But the even more important thing we found was that a lot of these people stopped understanding the work at multiple levels of their organizations as it changed. Once you get into a leadership role in 2 years, 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, and you haven't been working on the front lines for those years, and there's a lack of understanding that occurred as a result of that disconnection. One way to think about it, I don't know, I'm sure there's some Jets fans in the room. Now, did anybody of you remember this football game that occurred in November? The uniforms are a little bit different. So the NFL came out with these special uniforms in this game. They were all one color, green, all red. Normally they'd be different. Well, one of the problems was that there are 8% of American men are colorblind, right? So it was a lack of perspective. On one hand, you could say, well, who cares? I mean, who's colorblind? Not very many people are colorblind. 8% of 7.65 million viewers were not seeing that, all right? So there are these gaps that occur in understanding in our places. Lack of embeddedness, lack of understanding of how people see things from different angles. So there are gaps. We often, in homelessness, we talk about gaps in numbers, meaning like kids are not achieving at high levels in the schools, which they're not. There are all these other numbers that we know that are really important, but even more important, we found in some places were these gaps in perception within the organizations and outside of them, and at a baseline, gaps in understanding. right? So through embeddedness, places that had embedded leaders, like principals who spent time in the classroom, like executive directors who spent time serving lunch, like other places who embedded the other way, allowing those on the front lines to come sit in the leadership meetings, that understanding and perception were increased, perceptions of reality. So when we talk about embeddedness, we often talk about embedded journalists, in the military. Why do they embed in a military unit? So they can get up close understanding. Well, we found the same in a lot of our studies. So I had one social worker who shared this quote with me about homeless kids in her school. She said, "Our numbers are down, but we've got more homelessness in this school than we've ever had. I've been in this school for 26 years. Okay, so that didn't make sense to me. Because we even looked at the numbers, and this was a high-poverty school. The numbers were down in homelessness. And what she told me was that, there was this apartment complex right nearby. And there was a large immigrant population that had, in the last few years, moved into that place. Most of that immigrant population were not documented, right? So we had lots of families that were doubling up, tripling up in that place. They did not want to be identified, right? They did not want to be identified by anybody that they were homeless or anything different from just what everyone else was. So what she started doing was, rather than report them, she started spending 2 afternoons a week at a desk in the lobby of this apartment complex. She embedded in the place where they were, so she could learn from them, she could serve them better, she could understand them. The numbers never went up in that school, but the service to those kids and families, the connections that were able to be made, the understanding of them went through the roof. It's an example of embeddedness. So here's a question: is how do you learn from and understand those who are different in your organization? That means by gender, by race, by age, by position level in the organization. Do you allow embedded understandings to develop? Okay, the third E is this idea of experimenting. So I was real fortunate last month to be able to go to North Dakota to spend time with folks in North Dakota. Anyone here from North Dakota? No? There was some major flooding that occurred, and this is within the last couple of years in Minot, where 10,000 people were displaced by flooding. So we went from 61 kids who were homeless in 2010-11 to 1,417 kids the next year as a result of floods. In the same state, if you follow the economy of North Dakota, which I don't know if you all do, this is a thriving economy. Why is it a thriving economy? Because of oil, right? There are new things happening regarding oil there. So we have 12,000 new workers moved to North Dakota. So you look at the paper, North Dakota is doing well. The economy is thriving. But you go to North Dakota, and there's no housing infrastructure there to support all those people. So just in this one state with a very small population, we see homelessness playing out in ways that people had never thought about before. They hadn't planned for this massive flood. They hadn't planned for 12,000 new people to come to towns that were built for 1,000 people. So organizations cannot address out-of-sample problems. When I say an out-of-sample problem, I mean something that's never occurred before, something that hasn't happened, we haven't seen before, with the same old strategies. So one way to respond to that is to develop a culture of innovation experimentation. Allow new ideas to come forward. We work in places that are doing really important work, but some of the social service organizations that we spent time in were not places that fostered innovation. They were not places that fostered experimentation. They were not places that fostered creativity. There was a strong bureaucracy that defined certain positions in certain ways and did not allow new things to come forward. Let's think about a counterexample to that. Okay, so Google, every year, they kind of tinker with this homepage a little bit. They move a button one way or another. Looks slightly different. Well, every little change, they study this relentlessly. They experiment relentlessly. Every little change, even spacing the letters, there was an article about this in the Times several weeks ago. Even spacing the letters a little bit makes big changes, and they keep experimenting until they see what change catalyzes the action they want. People use it wholly differently than they did in 1997. An example of small tweaks incrementally, that a lot of our places, we don't foster small tweaks incrementally and look for things. Some places have adapted cultures of innovation. Here's an example of the federal government using it a little bit. Again, this story about copies, right? Anyone heard this story of one of the departments, when you went to make a copy in this. They made it so that every time you went to make a copy, a little icon would pop up. Do you want to make this a two-sided copy? You had to click yes or no. So, I think 6% more people made two-sided copies than they did the year before when they started that little experiment. But in that department, there were 500 million copies made every year, 500 million copies. So 6% of that is a pretty big deal when it comes to how that change affected. Another one was this idea of the college program, where instead of having these really expensive college preparation program, they sent kids 8 texts in the summer after they graduated. 8 texts. It was very cheap, $7 a student. Remember to do your financial aid form. Remember to send in your applications. 8 texts. That little program had higher returns than most of the super intensive college enrollment programs that cost hundreds of times more than that. A little experiment. The other experiment that was cited was that of a tax return. And federal vendors were asked, at the very beginning, some of them they did a little experiment. Half of them were asked, do you promise to tell the truth? And you had to check yes. The ones who promised to tell the truth reported way higher tax payments than the others did. They saved $1.6 million in this little sample than the others because they promised to tell the truth. A simple little experiment. Now, it happens in some schools too. This was a school that we spent time in, where there was a lot of the homeless students were not showing up to the social worker. She was the designated homeless liaison. They were not showing up to her, and we couldn't figure out why. And it ended up that most all of them were going to a bilingual resource specialist instead of her, simply because she did not. The social worker didn't speak their language, right? So all the principal did was start tinkering with different things. He sent out flyers to the parents. Go to the social worker. Didn't work. He tried an automated voice message. Go to the social worker. Didn't work. Then he took their offices. They were positioned in opposite ends of the building, and they put them in the same office suite, the bilingual resource specialist and the social worker. Put them, their desks right next to each other. Everyone's needs immediately overnight were being met because all those families started going to the same place. A little experiment. So Joe's got an experiment going with a new app they're developing in Pittsburgh. I know some of you in Dallas are doing these things. All these little experiments. Some are very simple things. Some are using technology. But it's experimenting. Experimenting equals relentless tweaking. Keep trying. Keep giving people different tries at different things. It requires can-do leadership, meaning allow it to happen. If you're in charge of an organization, allow people to try new things. And it requires everyday professional development. A lot of us, we gain a lot from coming to some of these types of conferences, which are awesome to have these opportunities to network and learn. But then sometimes folks will go back to their places and do the same old thing. This idea of experimenting means the way we work is that we try things. The way we work is we try things and we document them. The last thing I'll say about experimenting is that not only can it lead to kind of rapid change and improvement in the way we serve the homeless, it creates a better working environment. Right now, a lot of the places we worked with, a lot of the case managers were different every couple months. People had constant overturn of employees. Same with a lot of the lower income schools we went to. People in and out of the schools, new teachers all the time. Some of these places that fostered experimentation and gave kind of ownership, they were better places to work. The people wanted to stay there. They appreciated the opportunity to do things, to make decisions. So it's not just about the ideas, but the culture of work and how people wanted to stay there, to work there. So ask these questions about your own place where you work. So there's also a lot written in the kind of homeless literature about programs, after-school programs, literacy programs, all, again, very important things. But there's a part of this everyday literature talks about high-dosage things, like these everyday routines that we have. These are what you call high-dosage things in our lives, things we do, we get a lot of. If you live in a neighborhood that's a tough neighborhood, that has a big impact on you because you spend so much time there. You spend more time in your home and your neighborhood than you do in your school often. So why then do we focus often on lower dosage things like a once every week parent meeting than on the high dosage things that we're doing every day? So the literature says, for example, when do you think, I'll solicit a guess or two, when do you think the most meaningful conversations are had between mothers and daughters? What do you think? When, what, where? In the car, in the bathroom, and in the bedroom. Those are the three places research shows. In the car, in the bathroom, in the bedroom. Most meaningful conversations between moms and daughters. And there's lots of other literature about other family pairings, right? So when you're homeless, what happens to those conversations? When you're doubling up with two other families, what happens with those conversations? They're done in public, or they're not had at all, or they're done in contention, they're done in conflict. There isn't a car ride. I'm going to open this up and show. So we started talking about, and I've shared some of these ideas with Joe and others that I work with about, well, let's target these high dosage things, but I want to learn more about it. We learned a lot about it from the families we worked in. I decided I'm going to do a little personal experiment. Okay, I'm going to do, this isn't research, but I'm going to tell you how it's impacted me and the way I live and the way I work. I started documenting my drives with my kids. All right, so last year, on January 16th, I have 4 kids. They're 12, 10, 8, and 6. I started documenting every drive we took. I ended up being a chauffeur. Our high dosage is driving. All right, so we're in the car a lot. We live in a little town, Madison, Wisconsin, where we need the car. But yesterday I dropped my kids off at school before I hopped on the plane, and that was our 1,254th drive. And this is a high dosage thing. But what happened to me was this. We were just going to school. We were just going to church. We were just going to basketball practice. We were doing all these routine things. But as I started kind of documenting that stuff and learning about it and writing it down, I was transformed. I started viewing these kind of spaces in between, what you could call in-between times or throwaway times, and they became the most sacred times in my life. So we drove that many miles in the year. We drove to New York and back 9 times. We were in the car for 17,000 minutes, 284 hours, for 12 days. We started from home 553 times, ended at home 452 times. Most of them were short rides. What I wanted to say about that was that my drives are irrelevant to all of you. But what I say is we all have 1,254 drives in our lives, right? We all have something that is like that in our lives. And a lot of the families we work with, those 1,254 drives are shattered and they're upended in the work that they do. I even rated whether the drives were normal, a little different, or really different. Over 90% were normal drives. I gave them a 1. A 1 was a normal drive, nothing big happened. We talked about the Packers game or the Steelers game. It was nothing big. 96 drives were somewhat different, right? A little bit, something happened. We had a meaningful conversation. Like there was a little conflict that occurred. These were not all pretty rides, trust me. 2 drives were crisis. 2 drives were really different. And these were powerful things in my life. These were really difficult things that happened in our lives. I had my son 2 months ago broke his neck. I'm driving him to the hospital with a broken neck. He's okay, relatively speaking. But these are powerful times. Again, these are routine times and these are moving times, but these are the everyday. Why do I bring this up? Because first of all, we let these things fly through unnoticed in our organizations every day, in our lives every day, in the way we work with people every day, and we keep doing the same thing. I've changed the way I drive my kids to school. I've changed the way I respect those drives, and I cherish those drives. I was talking with Joe this morning in the room over there, and my kids called me up on their drive to school because we've gotten so used to valuing that time, and I talked to them from here. Again, I'm a flawed father in lots of ways, but let me just say that it's part of the everyday that we all have in our lives that we need to value and respect in those we work with. Those weren't just drives. Those were occasions for anticipation, reflection, and formation in our lives. And the collective impact of every day, the collective impact of 1,254 drives over the course of a year, it shapes our meta-anticipation, reflection, and formation. When I say that, I mean how we view ourselves if every day you're taking a 2-hour bus ride because you are homeless, and you show up at school tired and cranky because people were mean to you on the bus, or you had to transfer 3 times, it shapes the way not only how you do in school that day, but how you think about yourself and how you think others think about you. So let me give an example of a little school, a little child care center. Let me give you an example of an everyday intervention. There's a child care center we study, spent hundreds of hours in, that changed their morning routine. They said, okay, instead of having an open drop-off between 7 and 8 a.m., you have to drop your kids off between 7:50 and 8 a.m. It's kind of a punitive policy, right? 10-minute window. And they did it in this small little space, this small little room you had to drop your kids off. Well, what happened every day in that everyday routine, a throwaway time, drop off at school, right? The throwaway time, was that the parents started seeing each other every day in that little space for 1 minute. Hey, what's up? How you doing? Over the course of 200 drop-offs or 300 drop-offs, all of a sudden there is a peer network among parents that there wasn't before. There are social relationships that there were not before. They started strategically posting information in that little drop-off space for the kids, but also for the parents. Do you need a job? Here's where you go. It was an everyday routine that was made dynamic without any investment in resources. It was made better. Also, you see the teacher that's standing there every morning, or the child care providers every morning. So the other thing I'll say about that is our most high dosage place for kids is schools. Schools are the most public of organizations, right? We know when kids try to navigate through a social system, it's kind of haphazard what kind of program you find and what you don't find oftentimes. But public schools are where the biggest swath of our kids come. So if we're going to invest in the everyday, if you're committed to the everyday, let's do so with schools, in conjunction with schools, and let's build robust kind of centers of learning and connecting and developing. So homeless students missed an average of 4 weeks of school in New York in 2013 and 14, and 58% of sheltered homeless kids were chronically absent in New York. So what could we do in those spaces to make the everyday attack those numbers and get them into these spaces of development? We could do a lot. Here's a principal, Tiffany Anderson, in the St. Louis area who's doing that, or superintendent, I'm sorry. Rather than working on overhauling the math curriculum or the English curriculum, she started providing meals to kids. She started making sure kids were sleeping better. She started making sure daily routines were better. And what happened? Kids were healthier and the test scores went through the roof. She had focused on the everyday. So the question is, what are the 1,254 drives in the lives that your organization serves? Okay, and my last part, the last beat, is zeal in all practice. So, the other thing that we found in going to a lot of these places is just like you, there's a lot of energy in a lot of these places, people who really care about their work, people who want to do the work. However, we found that these systems, some of them public systems, some of them social service systems, had the capacity to beat people down. The systems themselves had the capacity to beat people down in their everyday work. It makes people feel like cogs in the wheel and paper pushers, right? Working wherever they were working in the system. The best places we found were places that worked with what we call zeal. What is zeal? An interest and enthusiasm that makes someone very eager or determined to do something. It's kind of a vanilla definition. But what we're more talking about is the difference between punching the clock and fighting for justice. And there's a big difference there, and you can sense it when you go into an organization what they're about. Are they punching the clock, or are they working for what's right and what's just? So zeal can be fostered by context. This is not just, you don't have to be a dynamic, charismatic speaker to work with zeal. All of these things we talked about before, giving people empowered to try new things in the office space, allowing them to embed in different parts in the organization, allowing them to connect to others, broker. These are things that foster enthusiasm. These are things that foster connections. So when we ask this question, what conditions in your organizations foster enthusiasm, passion, engagement, commitment, efficacy, hope, and love? That's a lot. What we're really asking is, what conditions in your organization foster zeal? Is your place a place where people can be excited to work and to serve the homeless? So I'm going to finish by, over the holidays, originally I'm from South Bend, Indiana, right in northern Indiana there. I took my family back to see my parents who are still living in the same house. For many years, they've lived in the same house where I grew up. We were there for just a couple days over the holidays. And I noticed something talk about an everyday unnoticed thing. I noticed something on the wall over my mom's little kitchen table that she's been sitting at for many years. Every morning she gets up and reads there. And this little plaque she has sitting above that table. And it made me start thinking a little bit, probably a lot of us have seen this. It made me think a little about this topic we're talking about, the middle part that says, the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. And I think often when we're working in the middle, we can become a little serene about, I can't change that. I can't do anything about that here in the middle. I think that's not true. I think that there's a lot that we can do working in organizations. I think we can affect the everyday. I think that whether you're a big policymaker, that's critical. If you're working on the everyday front lines of serving meals and giving vouchers, that's another thing. But I think if we work every day with zeal, we can affect the everyday opportunities of those we serve. So whether they are, your kids or my kids, I firmly believe that they're all our kids. And I believe that the everyday beats in our organization can make a difference. So thank you for your time. I appreciate the chance to be with you.